Picture the castle the way it's always been sold to you. Tall, gray towers catching the morning light, banners snapping in the wind, a drawbridge lowering for a returning lord, his armor gleaming, his horse stamping on cold stone. It's the image carved into us by 1,000 films and 1,000 children's books, the castle as a symbol of glory, chivalry, and power. Now forget that image, because the people who actually lived inside those walls would barely recognize it. For the men, women, and children who spent their lives inside a real medieval castle, it was not a fairy tale. It was a machine built for war, where every stone served a brutal purpose, where status determined whether you slept on feathers or on filthy straw, and where the difference between comfort and agony was decided the moment you were born. Behind the romantic silhouette on the hilltop was a world of freezing stone corridors, of disease that crept up from the latrines into the kitchens, of children who might not survive their own birth, and of a strict, suffocating hierarchy that controlled almost every hour of almost every life within its walls. This is the story of what it actually felt like to live, work, suffer, and sometimes die inside the walls that history made famous. Stay until the end, because the most disturbing part of castle life wasn't the violence outside the walls. It was something far closer, far quieter, and far harder to escape, hiding inside the very stones meant to keep people safe. To understand the darkness, we first have to understand why castles existed at all. Strip away the romance, and a castle was, in essence, a piece of military hardware. It was built in an age when there was no police force, no national army stationed nearby, no government office to call if your land was invaded. If you held land in medieval Europe, you defended it yourself with your own walls and your own men, or you lost it. The castle was the technology that made that possible. A fortress, a courthouse, a prison, a granary, and a home, all forced into a single structure of stone. This is why castles look the way they do. The thick walls weren't built for beauty. They were built to stop a siege engine. The narrow windows, the arrow loops, the spiral staircases that always turn clockwise as you climb, these were deliberate design choices, refined over generations of warfare, so that a defender swinging a sword with his right hand would have room to fight, while an attacker climbing up would not. Even the spiral stairs were a weapon. Every part of the architecture you see in old castle ruins today was, at some point, a response to somebody trying to kill the people inside. And that single fact, that the castle was first and foremost a fortress, explains almost everything dark about life within it. Because a building designed to repel armies was never designed for comfort. The people who lived there weren't choosing an aesthetic. They were living inside a war machine, and that machine shaped every part of their daily existence, down to how they slept, how they ate, and how they used the bathroom. Let's start at the bottom, with the people who made up the overwhelming majority of anyone living on or around castle land, and whose suffering is the part most documentaries skip past too quickly. If you were born a peasant in medieval Europe, your relationship with the castle began the moment you were born, and it was not a relationship of choice. Peasants, and in the earlier medieval period serfs in particular, were tied to the land controlled by the lord of the local castle. This wasn't a job. It was closer to a legal condition you were born into, one that bound you, and often your children, to work that land and answer to that lord, with extremely limited freedom to leave. Imagine waking before sunrise in a single-room timber and thatch home you share with your entire family, and likely your livestock too, since animal warmth was sometimes the only heating available. There is no glass in your window, just a wooden shutter. The floor is packed earth. You eat coarse bread made from whatever grain survived the harvest, perhaps a pottage of vegetables, rarely meat, because meat from the surrounding land largely belonged to the lord. You walk out to fields that are not your own, to farm crops that are not entirely yours either. A portion goes to the church as tithe, a portion goes to your lord as rent or labor obligation. What's left after a bad harvest, a wet summer, or an outbreak of livestock disease might not be enough to feed your own family through winter. And towering over your fields, visible from nearly everywhere you worked, stood the castle, not as a comfort, as a reminder. It was the home of the man who could tax you, judge you, conscript your sons for war, and in the worst harvests, watch you starve while his own granaries, protected behind those same thick walls, remained full enough to outlast you. This is one of the darkest, least discussed truths of castle life. The fortress that protected the Lord's food stores often did so at the direct expense of the people farming the land outside its walls. In famine years, the very walls built to keep a castle safe became a symbol of exactly who would survive and who likely would not. But don't assume that simply living inside the castle walls meant a life of comfort. For most of the people who actually resided within the fortress itself, not the Lord, not his family, but the servants, the guards, the cooks, the laborers, the stable hands, castle life was its own kind of punishing existence. Imagine the lowest servant's day. You rise in the dark in a small chamber you might share with several others on a straw-filled mattress crawling with fleas that no amount of washing could fully remove, because washing itself was a luxury of time and warm water that servants rarely had in abundance. You work from before dawn until after dusk, hauling water up from the well, feeding the fires that had to burn continuously just to keep the great hall from becoming unbearably cold, scrubbing pots in water that had likely already been used several times over, because clean water had to be carried in by hand, bucket by bucket, often from outside the walls entirely. Stone, the very material that made castles so formidable against siege engines, made them brutally inhospitable as a place to actually live. Stone holds cold. Stone holds damp. Even with fires roaring in the great hall, the heat barely traveled past the first few feet, and the upper floors, the storerooms, the corridors where servants moved constantly between tasks, stayed cold enough that frost could form on the inside of windows in winter. Many lower servants suffered from chronic illnesses linked to this damp: rheumatism, chest infections, joint pain that set in young and never fully left. And then there was the smell. This is something almost no fairy tale ever mentions, but it shaped daily life inside every inhabited castle. The question of where human waste actually went. Most castles were built with small stone chambers projecting from the outer walls called garderobes, essentially toilets built directly into the fortress structure, often little more than a stone bench with a hole, positioned so waste would drop straight down the outside of the wall into a pit, a moat, or sometimes simply the ground below. In theory, this kept the waste away from living spaces. In practice, the smell rose. It seeped into the stone. It mixed with the smoke from constant fires, the stink of unwashed bodies layered in wool clothing that was difficult to clean, the reek of the kitchens where meat hung and fat rendered and fish was salted for preservation. Now, picture this. Archers and soldiers stationed at the castle, in some documented cases, actually used these garderobe shafts and their characteristic smell deliberately, because the strong ammonia stench was believed to help repel fleas from clothing left nearby. Vermin were such a constant companion of castle life that people built entire small habits and folk solutions around managing them. This is the castle that almost never appears in films. Not a place of clean stone and gleaming banners, but a structure that, by the standards of any modern household, would have been almost unbearable to actually inhabit. Cold, dim, smoky, and persistently unclean, no matter high your social rank. Because here's the part that should unsettle you. Even the Lord, even his family lived with most of this. The smell didn't recognize hierarchy. The cold didn't stop at the noble's bedchamber door. Stone is stone, whether you're a servant or a baron. The difference between rich and poor inside a castle wasn't escaping these conditions entirely. It was having slightly thicker blankets, slightly more candles, slightly better food, while enduring fundamentally the same damp, smoky, vermin-ridden environment as everyone beneath them. If the environment itself was hostile, the human body inside it was under siege of its own. And this is where the story of castle life turns from uncomfortable to genuinely dark. Disease moved through castles with terrifying ease, and for reasons we now understand through modern medicine, but that medieval people could only interpret through fear, religion, or superstition. Water sources were frequently contaminated because wells, kitchens, and waste disposal all existed in close, often poorly separated proximity within the same walled enclosure. Dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses could spread through a household with brutal speed. Without understanding of bacteria or germ theory, medieval physicians explained illness through frameworks like the four humors, the idea that the body was governed by blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that disease meant these substances had fallen out of balance. This led to treatments that by modern standards sound less like medicine and more like quiet horror. Bloodletting, deliberately cutting a patient or applying leeches to drain blood, was a common response to fever, infection, and a wide range of ailments based on the belief that this would restore humoral balance. A person suffering from what we'd now recognize as a bacterial infection might instead be weakened further through blood loss at precisely the moment their body needed strength to fight back. Childbirth carried some of the highest mortality risk of any moment in a person's life, for mother and child alike. Without antiseptic practices, without understanding of infection, a difficult birth could become fatal within days through what was then called childbed fever. Surviving sources and later demographic studies suggest infant and child mortality across medieval Europe was severe enough that a significant proportion of children did not survive to adulthood. This wasn't a tragic exception, it was close to an expected, grieved, but almost normalized part of life, something parents braced for, even as they loved their children fiercely. And inside a castle specifically, this risk didn't discriminate by class the way you might assume. A noble lady giving birth in the finest chamber of the keep, attended by midwives and physicians, still faced real danger from infection, hemorrhage, or birth complications that no medieval medical knowledge could reliably solve. Wealth bought better food and warmer rooms. It did not buy modern medicine. It did not buy guaranteed survival. Now picture the castle not in peacetime, but doing the one thing it was actually built for, surviving a siege. This is where the dark fairy tale finally gives way entirely to the harder, more human truth of what these structures actually demanded from the people inside them. A siege could last weeks, it could last months. Sometimes, though less commonly than popular imagination suggests, it could stretch over a year or more. And during that time, every soul inside the walls, noble and servant alike, faced two enemies advancing from opposite directions: the army outside the gate and the slow, grinding starvation building inside it. Castles stockpiled grain, salted meat, and other preserved food, specifically because everyone understood that a siege wasn't a single battle. It was an endurance contest, where the side that ran out of food, water, or willpower first would lose, often without a single sword being drawn in the final days. Wells inside castle walls were treated as matters of survival, not convenience, because a besieging army that managed to identify and cut off a castle's water source could win the siege without storming a single wall. As supplies dwindled, defenders sometimes faced agonizing decisions about who ate and who didn't. Soldiers needed to remain strong enough to fight, but a starving garrison was a garrison close to surrender, regardless of how thick its walls were. Disease, already a constant threat in close medieval quarters, became even more lethal during prolonged sieges, when overcrowding, stress, and dwindling fresh food combined to weaken immune systems, precisely when illness could spread faster among people packed inside a finite stone space with nowhere to retreat. This is the truth historical sieges reveal again and again. Castles rarely fell purely to dramatic, sword-swinging breaches of the wall. Far more often, they fell to time, to hunger, to thirst, to disease, and to the unbearable psychological weight that defined existence inside these walls, even when no army was anywhere nearby. Because a castle wasn't only a fortress against external enemies. For many of the people inside it, it was also, in a very real sense, a structure of internal control.
Most people living on castle land, peasants, servants, even some lower nobility, had limited ability to simply leave. Serfs were legally bound to the land. Servants depended entirely on their lord's household for food, shelter, and protection in a world without social safety nets beyond family, church, or feudal lord. Even noblewomen, who enjoyed far greater material comfort than anyone else in this story, often had extraordinarily little control over their own lives. Marriages arranged for political alliance rather than affection, expected to produce heirs at significant personal medical risk, and subject to a husband's authority that medieval law and custom overwhelmingly protected. This is the quieter darkness sitting beneath all the cold stone and bad smells and dangerous childbirth and disease. It's the darkness of a world where your entire life, who you married, what work you did, whether you ate well or starved, whether you lived inside thick walls or outside them, was decided almost entirely by the circumstances of your birth, and almost nothing you personally did could change that. The castle, in this light, wasn't just protecting people from an external threat. For many who lived in its shadow, it was also the physical symbol of a hierarchy they could never escape. Walls that kept enemies out, but just as effectively kept the existing order locked firmly in place. So if you stood today on the grass where a real medieval castle once stood, walking through the roofless, silent ruins that tourists now photograph in golden afternoon light, what would actually be looking back at you if stones could remember? Not knights in shining armor, not banquets and banners. It would be the servant who hauled water in the freezing dark before dawn for 30 years and is remembered by no name in any surviving record. It would be the mother who didn't survive childbirth in a chamber draped with the finest cloth her family could afford. It would be the peasant farmer who watched his harvest taken to fill a lord's granary the same autumn his own children went hungry. It would be the soldier who didn't die from an enemy's sword, but from infected water in the 3rd month of a siege nobody outside those walls would remember by name. The castle endures in our imagination as a symbol of power, romance, and glory, and in some ways, for the people at the very top of its hierarchy, it genuinely was exactly that. But for the vast majority of human beings who actually lived, worked, suffered, and died within or beneath those walls, the castle was something else entirely. A beautiful, brutal machine built from stone and hierarchy in equal measure, designed above all else to ensure that the people already holding power kept holding it, no matter the human cost carried by everyone living in its shadow. The towers still stand in some corners of Europe today, drawing millions of visitors who walk through with cameras, marveling at the architecture, imagining a life of nobility and adventure. But maybe the real story worth remembering isn't the lord who lived at the top. Maybe it's everyone else, the people history barely wrote down, who actually built, fed, defended, and survived inside the walls that made that lord's glory possible in the first place. And the next time you see a castle standing against the sky, ask yourself, whose silence is really written into those stones?